Who's going to go first?
I can kick it off. We'll just do names.
Okay.
And then do it and tie it into, after we do family, we can do it and tie it into the letters.
We are doing the family piece? I thought we were just like introducing our names and like what letters we had, and then we were going to talk about like how they all connected. And then we could each go through and kind of talk about like what ours main talks about, and then the next person could like build off of it.
Yeah.
Unless you had a different idea.
No, that's good.
Okay.
All right, go.
Yeah.
All right. Hello, I'm Eli Maker.
I'm Sarah Rappaport.
I'm Jacob Abwoods.
And all of our letters have a common theme of mental health and the stigma around it, and how assimilation was very hard for the Jewish immigrants, especially in New York in the early 1900s.
Yeah, so my letter was from a Russian Jewish male, and it was written in 1906, and it really focused on mental health and cultural conflict. Basically, when he was in America, like, his wife was, like, very sick, and he had to make the decision between working and leaving her home alone versus staying home with her but risking losing his job, which added to the struggles of not only being able to like provide because he was making very little in the job he had, but on top of that it was like the feeling of abandonment and like what it means to him to like leave his sick, dying wife at home.
And my letter was written by an anonymous Jewish Russian female orphan. It was written in 1914. It's a pretty sad story. She lost both her parents, and it was about a story of how she wanted to go to the American dream and how she saw it as the life of luxury, but ended up working day and night, being a garment worker and having the pain and struggle and pretty much agony of just like always working and it being a non-stop thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Mine was about an anonymous male garment worker from 1911, and it's also very sad, like all of these, where he felt so isolated and so trapped in this new world he's in that he felt there's no other way out than committing suicide. So this letter that I had was a letter that he sent to the newspaper saying that he's going to kill himself on his birthday, which was in a couple days, because he assumed it was his only option.
Mine was writing, so the girl that I was writing about, she went to America with the quote-unquote love of her life. They weren't dating yet, but she was kind of still deciding, and she had actually been involved in the Triangle Fire, and my letter was written about, I'm thinking like maybe a few weeks after the effects. She was hospitalized, and she was not yet recovered, and she was just talking about how like she really needs to get back to work so she can suffice herself and her family.
I feel like work in general is like a really piece that like comes in all of our letters because of the long hours like that they worked. Like if they weren't working, like they weren't like making the money that they needed, and so I feel like it really like put them kind of in like this stuck hole where like work was almost like the only thing that they were living for. Like I definitely, that was a big piece of like my letter. It was like, if I don't go to work, yes, I'm home with my wife, but like what else am I doing with my life? So I agree that work is very
And I think when they came to America, they were almost promised this land of roads paved with gold for them. And I think they got here and they realized it wasn't like that. They were in the tenements, which is a whole other conversation we could talk about next, and the horrible conditions, and that they were in these garment factories working long hours, experiencing fires even, and they couldn't handle it. And that kind of brings me into the first question that I wrote down. How did the experience of the Jewish immigrants, such as overcrowding and poverty, contribute to the mental health that we see in all of our letters?
I think that it contributed really negatively because, like, again, when they were preparing to come to America, like, on the way, like, they were promised, like, this American dream in their head. It was going to be all perfect. They were going to come. They were going to have jobs, they were going to have places to live, and they get here and it's like you're living in these tiny apartments that are disgusting and filthy with like 9 other people, and you're working 17 hours making almost nothing in horrible conditions. And so I feel like it was a really negative impact because it was so different than what like their vision of coming to America was.
Yeah, and adding on to that, it was like poor working conditions. The wages were low, and a lot of the times there was a lot of frequent layoffs propelled into many of the ladies' garment workers union, and so that affected everyone's life because it made everyone poor and have a sad life. And the whole garment industry, what like at its peak, for like the fashion wise, was when all of like the girls that were doing all this work and like spending all their day and nights through these like poor work conditions, just put it as like they were suffering. It wasn't the peak of fashion; it was the peak of depression. Um, I feel like so the hard work brought leaders who were tired of putting up with these hard work environments, particularly younger women. They demanded better working hours and conditions and much more. This is all like when the protesting first happened, and there was something called, and it was an organization. It is the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, also known as the ILGW. They led a protest for higher wages, shorter hours, and just overall better safety conditions, because they had realized, wait, we have a say in this. Like, we came and we were promised all this good, and all we've ever been received and treated was poorly, and we've been sacrificing our time and life away just to be attacked. So why can't we fight back?
Yeah, I mean, unions were definitely something that were mentioned in my letter as well, except for like it was so much more than like obviously just the garment production. It was like meat packing and dairy, and like they all were kind of realizing that like how they were living wasn't livable, and that like they shouldn't have to keep going like this. And so they did start standing up and fighting for better wages and labor rights.
When I first kind of learned about the topic, I kind of thought, why couldn't they just get a better job in these horrible garment factories? But when you learn more about it, and through the letter and everything, it kind of seems like it might have been their only option, given they were Jewish and the stigma around them, but also that these factories had a work week that was unique in the way where they would get Shabbos off, because almost all those immigrants observed it at the time.
Yeah, and I think that's a big piece, especially in my letter. It talked a lot about like the struggle. There was another like situation where there was a man and he was engaged, and his fiance's family was like a very traditional Orthodox family, and they were like, we want you when you get married to like keep these values, to observe all the holidays. And he was like, he was a free thinker, and like he had arrived to America being like, let's like explore like what like it means to be secular and all of this. And so I think that was also like a really big struggle. Is it was like these jobs did allow people to observe like the holidays that they wanted to observe, but also in that like what did it mean to become secular, and like would being more cultural, would that help them like adapt more and help them assimilate?
I mean, it's interesting because it's also like assimilating, but also like we even learned about in class with the young boy who wanted to cut his beard off, but his father wouldn't let him.
Yeah.
It's kind of a huge thing. Do you want to cut it off to try to live a better life as an American, but you also then cut out a piece of your culture and that your family stigmatizes you for?
And I feel like it's really hard too, because it was the whole point of like you wanted to come to America to like live this better life and to have new opportunities, but also like you still have the history of like where you came from and like where you lived before, and like the traditions and all of that from there. And like so many, especially of like the older generation that came, like they did want to carry over that tradition. So I feel like it was a lot of like the children that either were very young when they came over, who were born in America, to like immigrant parents that were like struggling with that. What do I do?
Yeah.
Piece of it.
One thing about the children I can add on to is a lot of them were orphans. Like, they didn't have parents to come to this whole new town to, and what like they must have been super frightened at the fact that they're doing this alone, and they might have lost their parents due to reasons in wherever they came from, or even in America, just work conditions and killing them, and like either was sickness or hate crimed. Because I know a lot of the Jewish immigrants that were working were always hate crimed while working, which sucks because it's just like you're working for someone who hates Jewish people and who's really anti-Semitic, and it's your only way to live, and you can't really do anything about it, and you're put in a really awkward situation where you don't know what you want to do, but what you do know is you need the money to survive.
Yeah, and I actually have a quote that's kind of about the labor conditions here that really ties into what you said. Um, where a quote it says, "The boss's will was only the law." I think it's very deep, and it shows that whatever they want is what they're going to get, and the workers had no say in all that.
Yeah.
What do you think the orphans did after after the Triangle Fire and all the protests? What do you think happened to them? Like I know like they had to obviously go back to work over time because they probably, I don't know how long it lasted to be exact, but how long do you think it was till they aged?
I mean, I feel like even as children, like if orphans, like they were going to work because like it wasn't really like a situation where you could just be like, hey, my mom died, like can I like stay with you, because like everyone was fighting for themselves. So I feel like, especially like reading some other articles too, like these children were like, we're going to work and we're working in a lot of the same conditions that like adults were.
Yeah, and I think it's just resilience at the end of the day. They had to survive. They knew they wanted to stay in America because at the end of the day, while it was horrible, it beat the alternative of staying in Europe. Um, and that, fighting for yourself and kind of being alone ties us into isolation. And the isolation was just unbearable for them. And that contributed maybe in the largest way to mental health.
That's what I was gonna say. That relates back to like the mental health piece of like being like 8 years old and like having no parents and having to like go work a 12-hour day in a sweatshop. Like that is not a healthy condition for anyone to live in, let alone an 8-year-old.
Yeah, not only that, it brings trauma, and like from a young age to aging to be someone older and adult, like that'll affect you for the rest of your life. And everything that has happened to those orphans probably were affected by it, and probably continued more problems later for them in life, which really sucks because going through mental stress like that can really put an effect on people's lives.
Why do you guys think they didn't acknowledge depression as like a real thing back then? It was called, um, it was called uh, mila melancholia. I might be saying that wrong.
I just think they like didn't have enough time to worry about that. Like
Yeah.
they were always working. Like I don't think they had time to really think, hey, like my health like mentally is so poor and rationed, and like they were, because it's either they were either working, barely ever eating and sleeping. There was never like in betweens. There was never little cuts and breaks.
I mean, I agree, and also on top of that, I think even like looking into like today's world, I feel like a lot of there's so much stigma around mental health, especially for like the older generations. And so like if we're looking back to like the early 1900s, like if there are people who were born in like 1940s today who are like, oh, like mental health, like that's not a thing, like their parents are like the ones who raised them. And so I just think it also comes back to like it just wasn't something that was recognized a lot then, and like in the little chance that it was, like where these people were living in their communities, there were not resources to help them with what was going on.
And it's the pressure from the parents of saying it's not real and stigmatizing people having it was like a disease back then, that you were unwell and almost unfit to be in society. That made it worse.
Yeah.
And that contributed to like what happened to the man in my letter, where he's saying he's going to kill himself because he saw no way out.
Yeah, it's sad to think that like a lot of people that were affected by the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, like some of them made it out alive, but they were just like, I can't do this anymore. Like, life is too hard. But adding on to that, like, all these deaths had occurred during the strike, so during the protests too. Like, there's so many like different things that consisted of people dying, like whether it was either from the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire Factory or the protesting to just not being mentally well. And it's all different factors when you think about it. And it's really unfortunate that all these lives were lost. And when I read that it was the quote unquote deadliest industrial disaster in New York City's history, and one of the deadliest in the United States, there's many factors that are at play there. And this certain death brought numerous other injuries to the survivors, and the ones that survived and didn't do anything, like they were permanently damaged, whether it was mentally and physically.
I mean, I think there's also something to be said about like if we knew more about like the suicide rates. 'Cause I think it's talked about, well, you're never really given like numbers, but like in my letter, like when he's like staying home with his wife, at one point like the man who writes the letter wonders like would it be easier just to like kill himself and his wife and like move on. And so I think that also speaks a lot to like the time and what was going on.
Yeah.
And they were also sick, and they had such barriers to healthcare.
Yeah.
And like their teeth were rotting, they were not able to take care of themselves properly in ways other people were during that time, because they're given no access to medical care. In the hospitals they had access to, it was short-staffed, it was unclean, it was gross.
Yeah. And the worst part about it is, like, I know that about 80% of the workers were all women. So when you think about it, when they were trying to continue their bloodline and some of them were pregnant, a lot of them probably had a lot of miscarriages because they hadn't been able to suffice their own body enough, and they weren't able to eat, they weren't able to do anything for the baby to live, and there were many problems probably with that.
But how do you think, like, the continue of the bloodline? It's, very prominent in the Jewish religion. More religious people try to have more kids. Do you think it stopped them at times back then when they could barely feed for themselves?
I mean, I think like yes and no. I think there was always a thought of like we can't have more children, but there's also like when you don't have access to things like birth control, it's like you're not like able to like prevent a family. And so I know that like in some cases it was like you had 6 kids and you had no option but to go to work and have those 6 kids go to work because there's just nothing that you could do about it. So I do think that families were still just as big.
Yeah, and there were examples of even mothers sending their kids to work on Shabbos because they couldn't do it, but their kids, kids could, I guess. Yeah.
That's the age. That's how young the kids were working.
Yeah.
One thing about my letter was that the girl, how I had added on earlier, how like she hadn't really decided before she moved to America, she hadn't really decided like who this guy was to her, and they moved together, but she still wasn't sure if this was like the one meant for her. And the fact that like she went through all this trauma and drama throughout her experience in America probably didn't even give her enough time to really think of her own feelings or mental wellness. Yeah.
Yeah, and like going back to like the rates of like suicide and everything, like I used this source and it was called like Salt and Water, and it discussed like the high rates of suicide among Jewish immigrants, and they were often documented like in Yiddish newspapers. And it was just like I feel like on top of that, like reading those newspapers and just like seeing like, oh well, here's who's decided to end their life today. Doesn't help it.
And with the union movement starting, it helped a little bit.
Yeah.
But there was still not much to do, and the government wasn't doing much in New York, especially not fixing the tenements, even when they promised to with the Tenement Act.
Yeah.
They had 4 bathrooms for thousands and thousands of people living there.
Mm-hmm.
It's just unreliable.
And they were just like never taken care of. They were, and like not even really bathrooms. They were just rooms at that point with lack of like the facilities. Like they just weren't working.
Do y'all think like anti-Semitism played a really big part on how the workers buildings were, like how they were so dirty and nasty. Do you think anti-Semitism played a role with the bosses and the people that were over them?
I think yes.
I agree.
I think it's a no-brainer yes, but um, Jews were almost new to these people, right?
Yeah.
And so, of course, they were looked down upon.
Mhm.
Were all dirty, and it started that stereotype in a way that we even still see today. Um, so I think absolutely yes, but it was due to the fact that they were new to America.
Mhm.
I agree.
Yeah.
And with the health conditions, like going back to that topic, when all these immigrants came, pretty much mostly through Ellis Island, and they had to go through the medical examinations there, the mental health conditions there were poorly understood.
Mhm.
Mental health wasn't even questioned.
Right.
Like, you could get in any mental state. They were more focused on like physical illness, because actually my great grandmother, when they came over, she had pink eye,
Mm.
and they sent her back, and they let like the rest of my family go in. So like they were a lot more focused on like your physical condition versus your mental
Interesting. Where did your
condition.
family come from?
My family came from Romania, so
Oh, wow.
yeah.
But there are cases of people who were not doing well mentally, and they sent them back because they were unable to support themselves and make a wage
Yeah.
in America, which is very poorly understood, and it goes back to the mental health, of course. But my family, um, my father's side immigrated from Russia, and it wasn't Russia back then, but it was Soviet Union area, and then they came to Canada because they got turned away from America.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, my parents also, I mean, my great grandparents came from Poland and the Russian area, like you said. I know my great grandparents came about 2 years before the Holocaust had started, which that being said was the late 1920s. When they came to Ellis Island, they immediately told them that they need to have their last name be quote unquote American. And they were kind of confused. They were just like, what are you talking about, like American?
Yeah.
Because a lot of these foreign last names at the time had V's in them. Like my last name used to be Abovitz, and they changed it to Abowitz. So technically, I just have an American last name. It doesn't sound very American.
Right.
You can kind of tell it's Jewish, but
Right. Yeah.
it's not what it used to be.
We have the same situation. My family. It was my original last name was Mutzenmacher, but they changed it to Maker because it's more American, I guess.
Yeah, very
And it takes away part of your culture
dignity.
and your dignity. Absolutely.
Having your change, yeah, because like having your name changed to like help you fit in, it's like that's not who you are, and like you're being forced and made into somebody else.
As much as it doesn't affect us, it definitely probably affected our great grandparents because they were kind of just sitting there like, what? Our like identity just changed for life. Like, this is it. Like, there's no going back.
Yeah.
And do you think it was tough at first for them to adopt a whole new language when they're used to Yiddish?
I mean, yeah, it was like a totally different setting. Like, everything was different there. Like how, I mean, I know that the fact that they were treated poorly in both areas, but like, it's a totally different country and continent.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, coming into like, I think it's a much busier, much more like modern place. It's like gotta be a culture shock at first, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's also interesting to see how um, how Jewish assimilation places back then, little hubs of many Jewish people, have over the years. Some have stayed the same, but others have changed. I was in Toronto recently, and I saw one of the oldest Jewish synagogues, and it was filled to the street, similar to Stanton Street, like we learned about in class in New York, was full of Jewish immigrants. But it's not anymore. Now it's a new wave of immigrants that have taken over the street of Eastern Asian immigrants.
Mhm.
It's interesting to see how that has changed to fit a whole new wave of immigrants.
But it's like still staying a place for immigrants,
Exactly.
which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Um,
I think that's all we have for today, isn't it?
Yeah, it'll be easier when we get Noah's letters too.
Yeah. Thank you.
are you